Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to begin my speech addressing the government's latest budget by reviewing some of the claims that we've heard in this House from government members, beginning with this afternoon. I find it quite extraordinary that continually we hear the contradiction from government members that somehow Labor was fiscally unrestrained and spent every single surplus that we ever managed to create. Well, that's patently not true. In fact, when the government was in opposition, they spent most of their time trying to coax Labor into spending the surpluses, which we didn't, which is why we are now in the situation we would be in a much worse place had Labor not exercised the restraint that we did. And the second point that's continually made, and that I've heard in this House, is that Labor chucked the surplus at unnecessary programs. And so when I challenged a government member to name those programs, they were named as KiwiSaver and Working for Families. Now, if the government absolutely believed that those programs were unnecessary programs, then why didn't you get rid of them? Then why in this budget did you not get rid of them? I would wager it's because you actually understand that Working for Families is a targeted tax credit aimed at those who need it most, and KiwiSaver was not only necessary, it continues to be the one thing that I think prevents us from being in a potential superannuation crisis. And that is the reason why continually tinkering with it undermines the stability of the system. And that is the major issue that I have with the government's changes to KiwiSaver, not least the fact that it was actually breaking a promise they made to the New Zealand public. Two extra points I want to make. I've heard, I don't know how many times in this House, the statement that this was a budget for the times, that Kiwis and households would expect the government to do what they would do themselves. Well, it's not a hypothetical. Households are doing this themselves. When you've got a 4.6% increase in prices and only a 1.9% increase in wages, families are doing it tough. They are facing incredibly hard times as not just the increase in prices as a consequence of an increase in GST, but increases in ACC, in tertiary education, and the price of going to the doctor. Almost anywhere you turn, you'll find an increase in the cost of living for Kiwis. Kiwi families are having to budget. Now, the expectation when someone sits down and looks at their budget is not only to find places where they can exercise a little bit of extra restraint, pull back a bit of unnecessary spending in. The second thing that a household will do, which the government hasn't done, is they look for a way out. They look for a plan to try and remove the tight conditions that they're facing. Now, we know that a lot of New Zealanders are in fact doing that. Now, I don't think it's necessarily the best answer in the world is that mums and dads are going out looking for second and third jobs because that puts pressure on their families. But that's what they're doing. And we know that from the Household Labour Force survey that says 20% of people on part-time jobs, they want full-time jobs. Half of them are working 2, if not 3, just to survive. They are trying to desperately find a way out. This government isn't. And that is the difference. That is the difference between the average Kiwi household and what the government did with this budget. And the third point I want to make is that Bill English continually tells this House that this government has taken the sharp edges off the recession. I do not believe that for a second. We have a $16.7 billion deficit, but we have more than trouble in our books. We have extraordinarily high unemployment for New Zealand. It has nearly doubled since 2008. We've had a larger increase in unemployment than the US, the UK and Australia, all our comparable nations. Now, it is hard to survive on the minimum wage in this country, let alone an unemployment benefit, and yet that is what has happened as a result of there being a lack of a plan to turn this recession around, to bring us out of recession and to deal with our deficit. Now, if this isn't the sharp edge of a recession, I don't know what is. If being unemployed and trying to survive and raise a family on an unemployment benefit in New Zealand is not the sharp edge of a recession, then I challenge Bill English to tell me what is. If having no job or being one of those 1,000 Kiwis who queued outside a countdown in Hamilton for a mere 140 jobs is not the sharp edge of a recession, I don't know what is. Or the 2,700 people that queued outside a supermarket in Mount Roskill for 150 jobs. What about the 50% of young Māori or Pacific Island males who are leaving school without any plan to move into work or into education or training? 50% of Māori and Pacifica boys doing absolutely nothing. They are just part of the 77,000 young people not in education, employment and training. Now, the government can tell me that this is just a small blip in the program, but it's jumped from 58,000 just in the last quarter. If that is not the sharp edge of a recession, then again, Bill English needs to tell me what is, because his criteria is skew. Long-term unemployment has also tripled since National came in. Now, I have to be honest, there has been a response from government on this. It was future focus. It was their apparent welfare reforms. This somehow was going to help people into work. How does making people reapply for an unemployment benefit do anything tangibly to help them into work? And yet we had Paula Bennett boast today that we have 3,600 people who have moved off a benefit, but we don't know where they are. We don't know what they're doing. All we know is they haven't moved into a job. Now, that's 3,600 people who may be producing for this government a short-term savings in terms of an unemployment benefit. But we will suffer the long-term consequences of potential criminality, of that person being completely marginalised and no longer engaged with our system at all. Now, if that person is not required to walk through a Windsor every day or every week, to sit down with a work broker who is trying to get them into work, trying to get them into training or education, that is our loss. That becomes our loss. And not to mention the lost potential of that person who now has no support, let alone any potential to move into supported employment, education or training. It is a recipe for disaster. And that is what these welfare reforms have delivered for us. But what about the government's response in the budget to our unemployment situation, which, as I've outlined, is a perfect storm? The government has predicted via Treasury, numbers which they haven't refuted, that there will be 170,000 jobs created over the next several years as a result of this budget. I say as a result because the Prime Minister wavers between saying that actually that prediction is just following a trend rather than as a consequence of any direct initiatives in the budget. But we have contradictions all over the place. On one hand, when we ask the government what initiatives they've implemented to tackle unemployment, the government via the Prime Minister will stand up and say national standards is going to deliver us those jobs. If it's not national standards, it's ECE. And if it's not that, it's simply this, interest rates. Interest rates are the one thing that are going to deliver us 170,000 jobs. That is classic trickle-down. I don't buy it. I've never bought it. And the last budget demonstrated that it's already not working. I absolutely accept that it's the private sector in New Zealand that's generating the majority of jobs. I'm not disputing that, not for a second. But that does not mean that the government doesn't have any role to work alongside employers and alongside the private sector to stimulate job creation. First example, exporters are crying out for greater stability of the dollar. Crying out for it, and if we were able to deliver that, we know that that would increase our exports and thereby increase our jobs. Investment in R&D, PwC has told us that would contribute billions to our economy if the government was willing to incentivise it. All of this is the government playing a role in stimulating job creation via the public sector. It's much more active, but it doesn't deny that the private sector has a role in job creation. But it also doesn't allow the government to get away with the excuse of washing their hands in a recession, of having any responsibility for putting Kiwis into work. And that's exactly what that government has done. It's exactly what their budget has demonstrated. So this is the challenge I put to the government. If you believe it's all on the private sector, why won't you listen to them? Why won't you listen to the cries they're making, not only for assistance in these areas, but to also work alongside Kiwis and make sure that they're skilled, trained and ready for the workforce, instead of slashing $90 million out of this critical area. This is not just trickle down, this is blatant irresponsibility, and it is an example of the sharpest edges